The war in Ukraine may just have turned decisively. Ukrainian forces have breathed new life into their war effort. They have embarked on a stunning counteroffensive that has recaptured territory, destroyed key enemy military assets, and has sent Russian troops on the run. Mint breaks down the dramatic changes unfolding in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So, what exactly happened? Just weeks ago, experts spoke of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as a grinding war of attrition. Both sides had become locked into their positions with no way out. That changed in the first week of September, when Ukrainian forces exploited key vulnerabilities in Russian defensive lines to inflict devastating defeats and recapture massive amounts of territory, mostly in the country's eastern provinces. To understand why this is so significant, we need to go back to the start of the war. When Russian tanks and troops spilled into Ukraine on February 24th, they followed four major invasion routes. The northern route was a mad dash to Kyiv as Moscow tried to capture the capital and immobilize the top Ukrainian leadership. The eastern route went after major towns like Kharkiv and Sumy. Kharkiv, for reference, is the second largest city in Ukraine. The main effort, though, was concentrated in the south, in the province of Donetsk and Luhansk, and it was the Russian separatist population in these regions that triggered the Russian invasion in the first place. And finally, the southern route attacked major towns like Kherson and Mariupol, both of which were economically vital to Ukraine. That plan didn't quite work out. In April, facing fierce resistance, Russia changed the goals of their war. It withdrew from the northern provinces, from the front around Kyiv, in order to reinforce efforts around Donetsk and Luhansk. This strategy seemed to work. Moscow's men took Kherson and Mariupol, which gave them control over Ukrainian shipping, and also captured all of Luhansk province. It was then that the war turned into a stalemate. A town here, a village there, that may have changed hands, but the map remained largely unchanged. That is, until last week. Although the war had ground to a halt, President Zelensky's eye was always on taking Ukrainian territory back. After months of planning, Ukraine launched a devastating counteroffensive on Russian troops in both the northeastern and southern fronts. For weeks, Ukraine had been visibly gathering up for an offensive in the south. Russia noticed and began to send its best troops to the south, leaving only badly trained and domestic guards units in charge of the northeast. That was the opening Ukraine had spent months waiting for. President Zelensky's troops have exploited these weaknesses to devastating effect. Ukrainian troops have attacked and broken past Russian defensive lines last week and have been practically unstoppable ever since. Over 3,000 square kilometers of territory have been recaptured, including vital towns like Izum and Kupiansk. Russia was initially using the rail routes that pass through these vital towns as a staging ground for its invasion. Its troops are now scrambling to find a new defensive line as the ground is shifting under their feet. In the south of Ukraine, Ukrainian forces have mounted attacks on Russian positions in Kherson, a vital industrial town that Russia seized earlier in the war. Ukraine's gain in the south, while small, are still forcing Russia on the back foot. The message Ukraine is sending is clear. The tide of the war is turning. So how did this happen? How did the Ukrainian military, which most thought would crumble within days of the Russian invasion, turn the tables so completely? Essentially, three things went wrong for Russia. First, there appears to have been a massive intelligence failure on Moscow's part. Russian forces accurately foresaw Ukraine's intentions to launch an attack in the south, but didn't prepare for one in the east. When Kyiv's forces came crashing through Russian defensive lines, Moscow's best troops were stuck in the south. This brings us to the second major factor behind Russia's failure, the questionable quality of its troops. In the early days of the war, Russia sent some of its best troops into the fighting. Those units suffered tremendously and lost men as well as material as the war worsened. The American government estimates that Russia has suffered between 60 to 80,000 casualties in the fighting. With manpower running out, Putin's generals were forced to increasingly rely on newly recruited volunteers. These newer forces lacked training, experience, and equipment. When Ukraine's troops came crashing through their defensive lines, they crumbled. Ukraine's Western-made weaponry is also playing a role in the conflict. American HIMARS missile systems, Turkish drones, German anti-tank missiles are enabling devastating long-range strikes on Russian supply depots, ammunition stores, and military assets. Russia, by contrast, has turned to an unlikely source to make up for its artillery shortages: North Korea. The war is far from over. In fact, it may just be entering its most dangerous phase. In response to Russian defeats, Vladimir Putin's back is against the wall. Defeats in the eastern Ukraine make clear that his soldiers may be finished as an effective fighting force. Even his staunchest supporters at home are worried about the losses in Ukraine. Some have even called for his resignation. That means the Russian leader may turn desperate. Some fear that Putin, faced with defeat, may order a partial or general mobilization of Russian citizens. That would be a risky move. It would make the war deeply unpopular and all too real for Russian citizens. After all, the Kremlin's line has always been that the war in Ukraine is simply a special military operation. Calling citizens to war and putting guns in their hands would expose that lie and bring the war to Russia's doorstep. The more terrifying option is the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Some pro-war analysts on Russian state television have already called for President Putin to use limited nuclear strikes to stop the Ukrainian advance in its tracks.
Самое невероятное, что в конце концов все это закончится ядерным ударом, мне представляется все же более вероятным, чем вот такое развитие событий. К ужасу моему, с одной стороны, с другой стороны, к пониманию, что, ну что, значит так. Знаешь, меня...
Но мы-то в рай.
Да.
That threat is being taken seriously. Brigadier General Kevin Ryan, once a defense attaché for America in Moscow, said that if we consider the possibility that Russian troops might be losing hard-won territory to Ukrainian forces, the pressure on Putin to do something dramatic will be enormous. The war in Ukraine is likely to drag on as Russian troops continue the fight, but for every mile Ukraine's troops take, the war becomes more and more dangerous.